Om Shanti. Good evening. Warm welcome to this session of interview with the Raj Yogi. And I believe the topic is spiritual I, as in the letter I, referring to the self. But first, a reflection. These moments when we physically become quiet to a point of rest are often very refreshing. We can spend the whole day in a state of constant doingness, and it's extremely restorative to sometimes just be still. But even when the body is still and quiet, internally, there can still be racing, a lot of activity, always suggesting there's two separate things: the body and me, the thinker. And perhaps I, the thinker, have become more active than the body. Often running scenes through my mind before I physically arrive, and running those same scenes through the mind after they have passed. The degree of doingness that I have become. So not just the body becoming quiet, being at rest, but I, the thinker, coming into a state of being as well. Not a human doing, a human being. Om Shanti. Om Shanti. Welcome to Interview with the Raj Yogi. And so tonight's session, I warmly introduce with a reflection, the smallest word in the world, but I would say it's the most commonly used word in the world. So it's word I. So the title for this session is Spiritual I versus Physical I. So in terms of Raj Yoga, why is it such a big deal in terms of the contrast between these two words? Maybe for some of them, they don't even know what the difference is. Mm-hmm. I think what's unique in general about Raj Yoga is that it's able to invite us to try to get to the seed of issues. So we might feel peaceless or anxious or uncertain or just a little off. And we'll diagnose that in a variety of ways. Feeling often it's something outside. And what we try to look at is maybe the cause of that anxiety, distress, peacelessness isn't
outside. And I find that a very refreshing thing to introduce, because obviously, if I do think it's outside, I am left powerless. But trying to get to the seed of our distress or peacelessness. And so we go through the window of the thoughts. And if we can look objectively and clearly, we start to notice that our thoughts are very much shaped not by the outer world, but how I identify myself in the world. And so looking at the concept of the self in general, I think is really powerful. And then going a step further and asking us to explore, is my sense of self externally defined, or is it eternally or internally defined? And I think that's a really important question, because if my sense of self is externally defined, then my identity is pegged all to temporary things, even the body, it's all temporary. So I will most certainly die. But if my sense of self is not connected to external or temporary things, but eternal sense of self, as we say, spiritual sense of self, that completely changes the experience of myself. And it's such a deep reframing of the self. It can't help but affect how I experience going through the world. So it's getting to the very seed of life, really, is me. The center of our universe, if you will, is the self. So
It's interesting for those who were able to join for the experience. The theme was about being beyond labels. And I actually wonder how many actually find that they grapple and struggle with being labeled and want to be free from labels. And I actually remember when I first took the course and I first heard that you are soul. And it was just this thought that emerged in my head, which was, I am so glad I don't have to be labeled as one thing or another. But I think before that, I don't think I actually knew what you could do. You just were so tired of labels, and it's like you tried to run away from them, and I don't know if you really are successful.
it's difficult when there aren't options, when we do this to ourselves and each other. And it's quite ironic. I was laughing because just before we heard a class on loving the self, which frees us to start to experience God's love. It was quite interesting. And I was intrigued by that, because I came across a story, and the theme was love the self. And it's about a group of young men who are really promoting this theme, but have grappled with this exact issue of being labeled. And it was quite funny what happened. They were labeled one way, and then their career was taking them in a slightly different direction, which some might think was a different label. But then they were rejected by both labels because they're not one or the other, or they're disloyal to them both. And I certainly myself in this birth very much identified with this issue, because I was raised in a household which was very eclectic. It was not one or the other. And it was wonderful, but you landed up not attaching to really resonating with any of the labels. And it left you in a strange place. Well, then who am I if I'm not this or that? Because that's all we provide to each other. Even gender, you're this or that. And then we've got souls grappling. And it's a lack of option. As long as you're staying with the physical paradigm, you're going to run up against this problem. You can try to reframe and free yourself from it, but you won't. You will just become someone who doesn't like labels, which is another label. It's really a challenge in the physical paradigm to escape labeling. So we'd have to come out of a physical paradigm to become free from labels.
It's interesting because I recall, like, I wish I could have figured it out by myself
Mm,
because it would have been
yeah.
so freeing. But of course,
Mm.
there's a lot of other very insightful things to understand in Raja Yoga as well, in terms of that piece. And so, what would you feel that individuals even realized how profound and influential this one tiny word is?
I don't know if there's the word I don't know. I think we use it so much. I, it's become natural. We don't realize the force behind it. Um, that this little word has so much packed into it. We've packed so much into it. And always the invitation is to unpack it and realize this: who am I? And what kinds of answers come up? It's an innocent little word, but what kinds of answers? We really have packed a lot, and it's become just default. We don't even. It's natural now. It's our habit. We joke often that you can be in a room of people and they're all talking and saying each other's names and you don't even hear it. But if someone's in this noisy room standing in a corner and whispers your physical name, you'll hear it. Where that is just so default. It's so deep in us. These things. I am this name. I am this culture. I am this gender. I am these relationships. I am this job. We don't have to make any effort to sustain this very complicated, packed experience of I. It's so natural for us to latch on to what we call the four P's, but these different ways that we can define the self. And so it's quite challenging to become free of that, to start to explore, because of course they're all temporary. That's the problem. If we're saying, I don't want sorrow, I don't want peace, then what's causing us sorrow and peacelessness is that we're so attached to these very temporary experiences of I. And the moment they change, we're on a roller coaster. The moment that they change, our emotions change with them. So it's not that we need to move away from anything. We just no longer identify ourselves, think that that is who I am. So I'm not my job, right? So if things change, it's okay, right? Or I'm not the body. So if it changes, which it will, it will all change. I'm okay. So I need a sense of I which is separate from all these things I'm interacting with, so I can have a healthy interaction with all of these things.
Now, for many, this is quite abstract to them because so easily define themselves. I know that Judy had mentioned the four P's, but for those who probably don't know what those four P's are that we discuss in the in Raj Yoga, it is this package, that this image we identify. There's possessions, there's people, that is relationships, and then positions. So what is then, because I was sharing, it's abstract, like, and sometimes even spirituality is deemed as being something inaccessible. And so many ask, what does that mean, a spiritual life? Is it a living thing? This seems like it's just some strange concept.
I think we have made it into something that's not livable. Um, it's just a sign that we've become extremely physical. And we really are absorbed in what our physical senses can grasp and which science can show. And yet, if we're really, really honest, we are remarkably spiritual. Um, if you look at if you ask someone, why do you want to do this? Why do you, and you just drill them, interrogate enough. Okay, I want to work a lot so I can make a lot of money. Why? Because then I can buy nice things. Why? Because then I'll feel good. So feeling, it's the feeling good. Just cut to the chase. I want to feel good. So the things that we actually care about, the peace, the happiness, the love, the achievement, they're all non-physical things. You know, if I asked you, show me peace, and it's funny, we try to physicalize it. We say peace is bringing light to a village that has no light. No, that's not peace. That's bringing light to a village that has no light. Or peace is educating children. No, that's not peace. That's educating children. We're really grappling with it. We know exactly what peace is. We know what it feels like,
But we're always trying to
but we're
label it.
always trying to take it into the physical. Love. Love is when you give me chocolate. No, that's called giving chocolate. The feeling, we know these are all non physical things, thoughts, feelings, attitudes. It's all the spiritual is running the show. And so it's really odd that we've got a weird relationship with it because it's actually what we're doing, and yet we're not acknowledging it, or we're constantly physicalizing it. And that gets us into trouble because then we connect non-physical experiences with physical things. So, you know, I feel peaceful when I go to the mountains. I always found that really interesting. You know, today's a classic case. There's wildfires in the mountains now. Do you still feel peaceful when you go to the mountains? No. Now I feel scared, right? But I've connected the peace with something physical. It would be very useful right now to feel peaceful. It would help people a lot as the physical starts to fall apart. So we know what it feels like. We've just anchored it into what we're experiencing through the physical senses. And so we want to reclaim spirituality in an accurate way.
You know, this where this is going to go. There is a place of fear for some. It's interesting. They're talking about, we call bringing light to a village peace. Educating children is peace. Then peace is something that's so invisible. And if we're talking about a sense of I that's invisible, that's quite terrifying for some, especially when a sense of value, a sense of feeling that you're making a difference, a sense that you're making progress. We're looking for, we're always looking for signs of that. And so, how does one even begin to be open?
It's funny. I do think we have a love-hate relationship, and I know we've talked about this before. That I feel afraid to think of myself in a non-physical way, but in other situations, I definitely don't want to be thought of in a physical way. So now we're in a bit of a quandary, right? It's like we say, well, no, don't look at me by the color of my skin. Well, then, are you saying you're not your skin? Like, yes, that's what I'm saying. And yet, at another time, it's like, I want to be my skin. So we have to sort this out for
It's very confusing.
ourselves. We can't do both. We can't say, I am not the color of my skin, but I am my skin. That's a very mixed message. So I think that I can understand why it's afraid, but as long as we live in this very mixed up way, you can see how it's going to really cripple coming to any kind of resolution for ourselves or in larger global issues. We really have mixed messages. So, spirituality really, or this invitation to just put aside the word spiritual, just have an honest conversation with yourself. What makes sense? Um, I've seen situations, and we tend to glorify them, where people have lost a limb or lost this, that, the other thing, or they go, and they still seem to exist. So where do we draw the line? Like we have to kind of reconcile these conflicted ideas in our own heads, which I think is what a spiritual study invites us to do. And I think what's very sweet is when we look at little children, at infants, they really seem almost blind to the physical. They really are very sensitive or aware of the person, not the body, the person, the vibration of the person. So we had it. And then what happened is quite interesting.
Yeah. A couple of things. Part of the reason of bringing that up, and do we really realize the impact
Mm-hmm.
of this word that we use? And I know you touched on it briefly, but it's a part of making this my world in terms of what I really define myself. What has your experience been like to be able to move in this world where I experience myself not to be, you know, based on these physical labels? I think for some who take the course, it's still quite conceptual. It's still a challenge. For some, this is probably completely new to them who are
Mm.
watching. What has your experience been like?
I think many get very close to the doorway of this kind of thinking, but maybe using a little bit different language. Because one of the things that I know I experienced had to do with words like ego and self-respect. That when I have a very physicalized way of identifying myself, I'm really laying myself open for target practice, for ego, because we now are into a realm of external validation. It's not just that, it's one thing to say I'm the body, but we actually start to load that with value as well, our sense of value. So the minute that I'm able to let go of these labels, I feel more and more free. What am I free of? Ego. So that's why I'm not saying we need to walk away from the body. What I want to walk away from is this very dysfunctional relationship in which ego flourishes and self-respect dies. So rather than this constant seeking of external validation through these external forms of I actually reconnect with my intrinsic value when we say spiritual I, self-respect. That's the biggest thing, is that freedom from the really the harshness of ego, the pain of ego.
Have you felt that freedom, and perhaps maybe that's the part, is we don't even realize that there's, this real sense of self that actually has dignity and self-respect. We don't probably even use those words. That if I would just be able to let go of these labels,
Mm.
that there would actually be something much more valuable inside. What is this battle then? Have you experienced this battle? Maybe that's not really conscious to ourselves, of just
Yeah.
moving from this false sense of self to the real sense of me.
Yeah. I mean, once you start to, it's a very simple move, but because ego's involved, it becomes a huge battle.
Mm.
And it becomes more and more subtle and incognito. So yes, it's an ongoing. I would not in any way say, this is why Brahma Baba's last words, bodiless, egoless, are so fascinating. Bodiless simply meaning that I'm moving into a non-physical experience of I, in which there will be no more ego. But once you challenge ego, it fights back. So it does not like at all the move from a physical I to a spiritual I. It does not like it at all. So it's an ongoing battle
Mm-hmm. Hopefully not scary
with a
people.
happy ending. We are victorious, I reassure you.
It's interesting when you were sharing about for individuals who've lost a limb here or there. And I wonder if in those situations where maybe they don't even use that word spiritual, but it is about
Mm.
redefining one's identity. I
Mhm.
mean, I do remember taking some courses where whether we define ourselves by identity of gender or we call it masculinity, femininity, or whatever the case is, you identify with something about image. And when that something about the image changes significantly, you're grappling.
Mhm.
For someone who's just maybe hasn't taken the course or, then maybe not too familiar with spirituality, how would you help to share that that is actually still a spiritual experience that they're challenged with when some part of their image changes drastically, like
Mhm.
hair loss or they lose an
Mhm.
arm?
Yeah, I'm remembering, and I'm sure we've shared it before, but I am remembering meeting a young man um, who had been studying. As we say, he had it all. As we think of the physical as having it all. So he was very healthy. He was a triathlete, quite elite. He was doing pre-med studies, very well liked, and so really had everything going on. And he was out training one day and on his bike, road training, and he got hit by a truck and was dragged. Somehow managed to survive, but lots of grafting, reconstruction, lower body. So it just looks very different, right? And it took maybe a few years before I even could, got to the point of conversing. He tended to be quite withdrawn. And many, many years before he shared his story, and then even longer before the significance of the story. And what he shared, one thing I remember him saying is, oh, yes, science could reconstruct my body, but they could not reconstruct me. And yes, the miracle of science, what they did, but he felt quite shredded inside.
Mm.
The last time I spoke to him, just before he was returning, thinking of returning to his studies, um, I don't, I'm sure he's still struggling actually, but um, he said, I am so glad that accident happened because I could have gone through my whole life and never known that my sense of self and my value was constructed out of something so false. And that, the fact that those were all taken away, and he had this opportunity to, if you will, discover himself, what I really means, which is such a more stable, powerful, beautiful um, foundation for life, for the self. So it wasn't so much that we use the word spiritual in
Mm.
any of the conversations, but it was that sense of self was something that we used a lot. What is your sense of self? And is your sense of self based on very vulnerable, volatile things? Or
Mhm.
is it based on something solid that can withstand change? Because change is inevitable, but change does not have to mean that I am destroyed or my value goes or I react or any of these things that happens. It depends on what your sense of self is based on.
It's interesting because some know that I work in chronic pain, and spirituality is something so far away in terms of
Mm-hmm.
conversations of care. But when you mention that sense of self, which, like, there is no one who can actually negate that that's something important.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not about trying to change the words, but actually, perhaps maybe it's just how is this meaningful and relevant to every individual. And this even this topic, spiritual eye versus physical eye, that might not necessarily feel very relevant to someone at all. But But maybe that's the thing, is creating these bridges to see that no, it's always
Mm-hmm.
actually relevant, and maybe we don't even realize how we color ourselves with such temporary things all the
Mm-hmm.
time.
I think one thing that always, in terms of what you're saying, revealing the significance of it, one thing that most people seem able to resonate or at least think about, be open to thinking about, is the idea that, the most important relationship you have is with yourself. The relationship you have with yourself will determine, color all your other relationships. I think most can relate to that idea. So if you don't like yourself or you don't know yourself, then you can probably reflect on how that's going to show up. And so all we're trying to do when we talk about spirituality is we're looking at this relationship with the self. In fact, this true meaning of religion or religio is to reconnect with the self. So we're just trying to restore the dignity, the peace, the truth, the purity of that relationship with the self. And then we start to layer words like to love the self, to care for the self. You know, what if I'm pouring all of my love and care into things that aren't even me? Right? And thinking I am loving and caring for the self, but it's not even really. So I think it's really important, this relationship with the self. And so it's almost like reintroducing myself to myself. And relative to what you're sharing, the need or call to do that will vary from person to person.
Mm.
Someone may have say, I don't have a problem. I know myself. I'm fine. Everything's good. So this conversation is really only relevant to someone who is ready or interested in looking at that relationship with the self.
Mhm. It's, I feel that we're now starting to move into a previous topic that we've talked about, which is, awareness, pure awareness, consciousness. What am I? What am
Mm.
I really? That you can move from a very physicalized sense of self to a non physicalized sense of self. It's quite thought provoking.
Mm-hmm. There's a one kind of interesting, perhaps jarring idea that can come up in this study is that very often the ones that, even if it's only momentarily, seem interested in a spiritual conversation or at a funeral. Because at that moment we really come face to face with what am I? And many have shared when they see the corpse or the body, they don't feel the person is there anymore. They're very aware that that's just matter. So that really brings us face to face with the question, which obviously we'd like to understand before that moment. But really, what are we? And again, we're very selective in how we look at that. I remember, and I've shared before, having a conversation with a peer in university. I was in psychology, she was in biology. She was very interested in having a family. And I don't know how we got to this conversation. And she was a friend, so it was a very tense moment. But in psychology, I said, no, I don't think we're bodies. I really think there's more to us. And she's like, no, we're just cells and synapses and sinew. And I'm looking at her and like, she's mad. And I'm like, wait a minute, you're, when, you want to have a family. So when you have children, you're going to look at them as sinew and bones and synapses, and that's it. That's how you're going to look at them. And she just stopped. She just, of course, we don't look at people that way. We do and we don't. And that's again the problem. We do and we don't. We're very inconsistent in, it's clear that there's something not quite resolved within ourselves. Sometimes we look at people just as bodies. Another time, that idea is completely repulsive to us. We think that destroys the relationship, you know. So we kind of have to sort it out, what we are, who we are. And when we look at each other just as bodies, just as positions, status, employers or employees, as possessions, what you have, what does that say about the dignity or the value of the relationship and what will happen when there's a change? So we just have to kind of, when we're ready, reflect on these and again, what is causing the peacelessness, this interesting connection that spirituality, that this ego is really creating havoc in our lives, and it spells based on what we call a false I. So if the word spiritual doesn't appeal to you, we're talking about the real or authentic me and the false or image me. And how do I get to the real, authentic me?
I know we're running close to the end of the session, but we may have to have a part two with some of the other questions that came up. But it was interesting you're sharing about that young man who was a triathlete, and that he was sharing that he was really glad that he had gone through that experience. And that part, actually, what I found that was really interesting was because he realized he would never want to continue living a lie. And so, just that last comment, if you want to share about it, it's like, no matter what, it seems like we really care a lot about authenticity.
Yeah, there's just some interesting points that are connected. We know that with physical objects, when we authenticate something, it's, if it was a painting by Van Gogh and someone comes in and says, this is a painting by Van Gogh, and you go, whoa, 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 we have to get someone to authenticate it. And so someone authenticates it and says, it is indeed a painting by Van Gogh. Now we can charge $3 million for it. But if it's considered a ripoff or not, then we just, $3 for it? That's a huge difference simply through authentication. So imagine what that means about me. And the thing he did share was that his confidence, his sense of self-worth nosedived. That was the part that surgery could not fix. His sense of self-value went completely. And it was so interesting, you could feel all these beautiful qualities, which is what spirituality looks like. It's just the character or the qualities of the being. It doesn't matter if he's not in medical school. It doesn't matter if he's not. None of that mattered. It was the character, this good heart. That's who we are. Or that is that character, which isn't a physical thing. But he had based so much of himself on the physical that he couldn't appreciate who he was. He only could feel what he had lost and how he was trying to build. So I think it's, I think that we do have a deep pull for authenticity. We know it's valuable and we know that it's not superficial. So I think, grappling with these ideas inside and seeing if I know it's a little frightening because it's a huge upheaval or reframing of our lives, but to find that it's not a loss to go through this journey, it's not a loss. It's actually restoring our value.
I do feel we need to have a second session because we didn't really touch on the power. Like, we know how powerful it is, or maybe we don't know how powerful it is, but there's certainly some aspects in terms of just how abstract some may find this to be, but yet at the same time, how impactful it would be depending on which paradigm, I suppose, I'm in. So thank you for joining. Perhaps we'll go into a little reflection now.
As I sit here, I observe the body. will come a point when this body no longer moves, the heart no longer pumps, the lungs no longer breathe, when it becomes non-living. And so what happens to me if I am the body? But even more so, what's happening right now if I can observe the body as if I am separate from the body. The body does not observe me. I observe the body. And I observe the wonder of this body, all those different functions and how it can move. But when it comes to qualities such as peace or love, kindness, compassion, forgiveness, whatever quality is important to me, that can be expressed through the body. But the quality is not a capacity of the body. Those qualities are not shown in any anatomy book. They are expressed by me through the body. As I sit here, I just start to explore my relationship with this body. And is there a loss in thinking there is me and there is the body? Is there any loss in not feeling I am the body? It seems like everything keeps functioning. But through changing that relationship, I start a journey of understanding myself in a different way that is no longer physical. Really getting to know myself. Om Shanti.
Thank you, Judy, and thank you for those for joining this evening. Pass it on to Judy once again as well to let us know what upcoming sessions we have going on.
Thank you, Nora. I'm not sure I actually know the details, but I can give you the broad strokes of what's going on. Okay, I'm going to get props from the side. So we do have drop-in meditation Tuesdays and Thursdays, 6:45 to 7:30 p.m. And of course, they're all archived, so you can watch at a different time if needed. We also offer it now Sundays, 6:30 to 7:30 p.m. And we also have on Tuesdays and Thursdays, which are recorded and stored on our YouTube page, Interview with a Raj Yogi, what you were enjoying just now. The ones on Thursdays look quite deliberately at the essentials of Raj Yoga. So the one coming up this Thursday is on Purity Part 1. Wow, that sounds exciting. I might come. So Purity Part 1. So you're most welcome to join. And of course, we still have Inner Fitness on Saturdays. That's also on our website, on our YouTube page now. And that's 2 to 3 on Saturdays. And the theme this Saturday is alignment. Fantastic. So perhaps we'll see you there. That's on the Zoom platform. So go to our website in order to get that link. And thank you so much for joining this session. Om Shanti.